Teddy, a brown field spaniel, sat waiting by the door. All morning, a sad man named Parker moved purposefully around the 4-story building. They were going somewhere. Parker had packed his bag the night before and spent the morning walking and feeding Teddy, closing and locking all the windows and doors. These actions meant travel, and Teddy accepted that he would have a long ride in the big black car. It wasn't always like this. Teddy was happy with Anne. He had a vague idea of what happened to Anne. She was there as he grew from a puppy to an adult dog. They lived in an apartment in a big city in the South. When going out for a walk, we rode the elevator. There were no stairs there. In the same multi-story building, there was only a staircase, and a person constantly walked up and down along it. Teddy explored every floor except the last. They never made it to 4th. Each floor of the house was as large as Anne's apartment, but they were cold, lonely spaces. Teddy missed Anne and her warm, sunny apartment. Teddy lived with Anne for 6 years, although she was barely home for the last year. They went everywhere together, inseparable companions. If you were traveling in a car, then in a yellow taxi. Anne always sat with Teddy in the back seat. He sat at her feet and she hugged him. Parker had a big black car called an SUV, and Teddy was pushed into the back seat. This worried him, especially after he lost Anne. Trouble came with a smell. One morning, Teddy woke up on the corner of Anne's bed to a strange smell. Teddy's nose was very sensitive. His breed is distinguished by its ability to sense what is hidden, what is disguised under other odors. It was there, a faint, intoxicating smell. He couldn't tell her about this. He had no way to warn her of danger, but he became more affectionate to compensate. As time passed, the smell affected Anne more and more. One day she left Teddy in the care of Liz, who lived in a neighboring apartment. Anne told Liz, "Teddy is not used to being alone. I'll be back tomorrow. Just one night for tests." Liz had a cat named Simon who wouldn't leave Teddy alone. He insisted on rubbing up against the friendly brown dog. Because of Liz's cat, the spaniel had to stay alone in Anne's apartment. Liz was good, but not Anne. When Anne returned, she was gloomy. Teddy did his best to cheer her up. However, a period began when Anne left, always saying that she would return soon. When she left, the unpleasant smell was strong, and upon her return it became less, but it never completely disappeared. After Anne first left, Liz or another neighbor came to feed and walk Teddy, but mostly he was left alone. Teddy waited impatiently for Anne to return, and for a while everything became almost normal. But Anne became weaker and weaker, and their walks became shorter and shorter. Soon they almost never left the apartment. Anne left for the last time, hugging Teddy tightly, but did not promise to return. Teddy waited and waited. At night, the apartment was dark and lifeless. Liz or someone else came once or twice a day, no more. Teddy was alone. And then the day came when Liz fed him and said with tears in her eyes, "Your new master will come this afternoon." On this day, a man named Parker came. There was a deep sadness emanating from him that Teddy could see and feel. Liz let Parker in and they collected Teddy's bowls and toys, the coat he wore in the winter, the rug and blanket he slept on. Parker put the leash on Teddy's collar and tried to lead him out of the apartment, but Teddy pulled away. He needed Anne. Parker seemed to understand. The man knelt down and said, "She won't come back, boy, and you know it. She died in the hospital. In the ward next to the one where my wife was lying. They both left. I promised to take care of you." The man patted Teddy on the head and patted him lightly, and Teddy stood up and left the apartment. Teddy rode the elevator for the last time. He sat in the back seat of a big black car, all alone, and they drove far away. We arrived at his strange house, where we now lived alone. Teddy could smell the woman gone and the man's pain, so similar to his own. They were together, but each of them was still alone. Parker Jones met his wife, Lenore, in Chicago during the summer of his second year of law school. At a college that mostly taught physics, he enrolled in law school, hoping to become a patent attorney. However, the only summer internship he was able to get was at an arbitration firm. Arbitration judges desperately needed someone who understood fiberglass electrical wiring to help with a major construction case in Chicago. Parker, who laid cable for AT&T while in college, accepted the out-of-state job. In Chicago, with nothing to do on the weekend, he took a field trip to the Art Institute one Saturday morning. Lenore Campbell was 23 years old and had a master's degree in fine art. She painted with oils and acrylics, but could not find any lucrative work other than as a tour guide. Parker bought a ticket for the tour, but spent his time watching the cutie, Petite Blonde tour guide. He followed her through the decorated rooms of the museum. He never worked up the courage to talk to the woman he liked. In total, he attended the excursion 3 times in a row on Saturday morning. At the end of the 3rd excursion, Lenore came up to him and said, "Hello, I'm Lenore, but people call me Len. I'm also quite impatient, so here's my phone number and address. I'm free every evening except Tuesday." Lenore made the first move, and over the course of the summer, the relationship blossomed. Introverted Parker quickly fell in love with the lively, outgoing Miss Campbell. The interaction was perfect. In a fit of passion, opposites attracted. They were both virgins and remained so until mid-August. Arriving at Lenore's apartment for a Friday movie date, Parker discovered that her roommate had left for the weekend. The film played on DVD Netflix in Lenore's bedroom. Just in case, Lenore took pills. They became very excited by each other, but the first time did not last long. Fortunately, they found that Parker recovered quickly and lasted much longer after the first incident. However, Sunday morning came too early, and Lenore was thoughtful and a little distant. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No, only that our weekend is coming to an end. There will be other weekends, and weekdays too, unless this is your way of leaving me." No, she said, moving forward for a kiss. "I just can't continue working as a guide for the minimum wage. I need a real job to pay my expenses until I become an artist. I used to think that success would come immediately, but it didn't happen." "Well, you're very talented, and I'm sure you'll find something. I'd like to help, but I'm just a summer intern. At the end of the month, I will be fired." She laughed and said, "In fact of the matter, I found something. Next week, I begin a teacher training program in New York at Brooklyn College. This will give me a degree in education and allow me to teach art in public schools. I planned our weekend taking into account the fact that it might be our last for a long time." Now it's Parker's turn. He laughed and said, "It's funny. I'm returning to NYU a week after you leave for Brooklyn." They moved in together that fall and married the following year, just as he graduated from law school. He was hired as a junior lawyer at an arbitration firm. It wasn't his dream job, but he took it to support them. Lenore was having trouble finding work as a teacher. Before the birth of their first son, Daniel, she worked part-time as a substitute teacher. She spent the next year caring for Daniel and painting. Being in the lowest position in the firm, Parker had to travel a lot. Returning from a trip to Buffalo, he found his wife waiting for him in a new nightgown with a bottle of champagne. "On what occasion?" he asked. "I won," she answered. "Did you win?" "Nevis Arts Award for oil painting." "About? Congratulations." The prize was a whopping $500, but more importantly, it came with a gallery exhibition for the winning artists. The New York Times reviewed the exhibition and especially praised the work of emerging artist Len Campbell. A series of gallery exhibitions followed, with one good review after another. The name Len became recognizable, but it did not bring in much money. Daniel was 5 years old and had to go to school. The question of public or private education came up, and by then he had a younger brother, Derek. While parents were trying to decide whether they could afford a private education, the State University of New York offered Len Campbell a position as an assistant professor at Albany. Parker was already a junior partner by then, but he didn't hesitate to pack up and move in with his wife. This was the best decision for his family, although it did not help advance his career. "I'll find some work," he told Lenore. And so it happened. He found work as a freelance arbitrator in small construction disputes. The Joneses bought a dilapidated house in one of the old industrial towns on the east side of the Hudson and lived in it. Len turned the top floor of the house into her studio. They had a decent income for upstate New York, Still, artist Len Campbell dreamed of one day having an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. Parker's dream was a happy, calm life. When his second son went to college, he thought he had achieved it. But fate was not kind to him. Lenore wasn't feeling well. After much debate, she followed his advice to take advantage of government health benefits and undergo a medical examination. Thus began a long series of examinations, ending with a quiet conversation in the oncologist's office. Teddy was getting used to his new existence. Right outside the house was a park called the Commons. There were a lot of dogs playing there and the people were friendly, but it wasn't the same. He missed Anne, and when the weather turned cold in November, other dogs and people began to appear less and less. It was much colder than in the city, and they had few visitors, only a young man and his wife. The young man was not bad. It was Parker's son, Dan. He was tall like Parker and looked somewhat similar. But the woman, Dan's wife, did not like dogs. Teddy noticed this. This woman annoyed Parker. She criticized his house for being old and their neighborhood for being poor. "It's time to go," Parker said, grabbing the leash with one hand and the bag with the other. "The family will wait, and now that my Lenore is gone, we are at the mercy of our relatives for Thanksgiving." However, as they were about to leave, the phone rang. Parker picked up the phone. "Hello?" he said. "Oh yes, sorry, I didn't want to answer you. The point is that I need more time." Parker paused, listening to his interlocutor. Teddy lay down on the floor. These calls only made Parker sadder. "Yes, I understand that this is a great honor, and of course, Lenore deserves it, but for now I cannot part with her paintings. I need more time." Parker paused again, listening, and then said, "I promise I'll make a decision soon." Parker hung up and turned to Teddy and said, "Come on, guy, it's time to go." With those words and his slumped shoulders, they walked out of the house and across the small back garden, now dark and devoid of flowers, to a black car. Teddy climbed into the back for another long, boring ride. At the end of it, Teddy found himself in a place with perfect lawns and surprisingly similar houses. It seemed that they were outside the city, but there were fewer trees than in the city, and none of the streets went straight, but seemed to twist endlessly. Dan met his father and Teddy at the door. He hugged the older man. Looking past the men, Teddy noticed how a frown crossed the woman's face, giving way to an artificial smile. They were shown to a room at the back of the house. There seemed to be almost no stairs as everything was on the same level. However, there was a cat named Samantha, a large yellow tabby that hissed at Teddy and then walked away. Parker settled in the back room and then took Teddy for a long walk. When he wasn't out, Teddy was confined to the back room, but apparently so was Parker, or at least he preferred to stay there with Teddy rather than spend time with his relatives. Parker, Teddy realized, shared the same deep sadness. They both lost the only person who made their lives livable. The next day was crowded, and late in the morning guests began to arrive. Teddy was brought out to meet them. The cute brown dog with a friendly and affectionate character was immediately liked by the guests. Early in the day, Parker took Teddy for a walk through the winding, narrow streets of the village. When they returned, Parker's son Dan was talking to the couple in the foyer, taking their coats. "Oh, Dad," Dan said, "let me introduce you to Professor Stevenson and his wife." "Hi, Jan," Parker said to the red-haired woman. She turned to her husband and said, "Frank, this is Parker Jones. His wife was in the hospital at the same time as you." "Nice to finally meet you," Parker said, extending his hand. Frank Stevenson was a very tall, thin man with the overly gray pallor of someone recovering from a long illness. It was also noticeable that he was almost 2 decades older than his wife, a woman in her 30s. Stevenson accepted Parker's hand reluctantly, with resentment that Teddy could feel. Perhaps it was Parker's good health or the warm smile his wife gave to a man a good dozen years her husband's junior. "Oh, is that Teddy?" Gene Stevenson exclaimed. Jean squatted down to pet Teddy, and when he hugged her back, she laughed with delight. "Oh, I heard so much about you from Anne. She was a magnificent woman, and I know you must miss her, but now you have a wonderful man as your owner." Rising to her feet, she said, "I'm so glad you took Teddy." Fulfilled Anne's last wish. "I know he will have a good home with you." Jean paused and added, "I was so sorry to hear about Lenore. Perhaps it was for the best. New York was our last hope. Lenore fought to the end, but there comes a point when the struggle becomes worse than the disease. I know she and Anne are somewhere together, looking after Teddy and me." Then Dan, Parker's son, burst in. Squeezing his father's hand, he said, "That's right, Dad. Stay positive. And by the way, you and Professor Stevenson will have a lot to talk about. He was my contracts professor at Albany Law School. I told him that you were an arbitrator in the construction industry." Frank Stevenson nodded his head to Parker and moved towards his wife, wrapping his arms around her waist. Frank's movement brought him closer to Teddy, who caught the subtle scent and jumped away from the stranger to hide behind Parker. "What's the matter, boy?" Parker asked, patting Teddy on the head. "Perhaps all these new faces are overwhelming him," Jean suggested. "Yeah, this place is getting too crowded for one dog," Dan said, waving the Stevensons toward the living room. As Jean left, she said to Parker, "We should exchange the latest news later." Jean smiled sadly over her shoulder at Parker as her husband's hand nudged her forward. Parker, in turn, was full of memories. The experimental cancer research took place in New York, at Sloan Kettering. The journey was long, but it was their last hope for remission of the cancer that was killing Lenore. They checked in at 5 a.m. on the day of her initial examination. Lenore was wheeled away on a gurney and given formal instructions to Parker where he should wait. Parker wandered around looking for the waiting room, asking one volunteer after another where he needed to wait. They tried to help him, but they didn't seem to have the slightest idea. Finally, an off-duty nurse pointed him in the right direction, and he found the waiting room. It was a quiet place with a single TV set to an appropriately monotonous program. Luckily, he settled down with the book he brought with him. In the early morning hours, the waiting area was relatively empty. The only people there were Parker, an older woman with a young man who might have been her grandson, and an attractive red-haired woman leafing through old magazines in the waiting room. As time went by, the room became either crowded or empty. Only the red-haired woman remained unchanged. It was already past 1 o'clock in the afternoon when his mobile phone rang. The nurse called and said that his wife was being admitted to the hospital and that he could visit her after 5 o'clock in the evening. "There's a decent cafe a few blocks from here," said the red-haired woman standing next to him. Her name was Jean Stevenson, and her husband, Frank, was undergoing the same cancer treatment as Parker's wife. "He's been fighting cancer for almost 5 years," Jean said, over a light green salad at a small cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. "It's been 2 years for us," Parker said, staring at his turkey, but unable to convince himself to take a bite. "But it seems like more has passed, almost an eternity. And yet, time is so short," Parker thought. Jean was 37 and had been married for a dozen years to her former law professor, a man 15 years her senior. She was childless and the only survivor of her own family. This was Frank's second bout with cancer, or third, depending on how you count them. She volunteered details of her life. She was human, desperate those in need, in an interlocutor who could understand her. Parker's great gift as an arbitrator was that people instinctively felt they could trust him. Parker always showed his natural compassion. In this case, however, he and Jean Stevenson shared a common experience and a similar desperate need. "You can't convey how you feel, and you don't dare show your fear," Parker admitted. "You should always stay positive," Jean answered. They smiled at each other. 2 people stuck in their roles as caregivers. This was their first time together. 2 people who came to support their spouses came together for mutual support. They were lonely because, caring for another, they were separated from the flow of the living world around them. Naturally, they were drawn to share their hardships together. The hospital had lists of restaurants and hotels that offered special rates to patients' families. Jean and Parker naturally began having late dinners together after visiting hours ended. We often stayed in the same hotel. This happened at the end of December, shortly before Christmas. New York was lit up in anticipation of the holiday. There was fun everywhere, but it was a dark time for Jean and Parker. Lenore shared a room with Anne Cummings, a book editor whose family included a brown dog named Teddy. That morning, Parker arrived at the hospital to find that Anne and Lenore had been moved to separate rooms. He had been in the hospital long enough to know that this was not a good sign. Both women were losing their fight against the disease. That night at dinner, Jean was in even worse shape than Parker. "We had a fight," she said. "There was no good news today, and I think Frank didn't have a more convenient punching bag." "It's difficult," Parker consoled. "Pain is bad, but fear is even worse. Lenore is now in a separate room." "It may not mean what you think," Jean said, reaching out to cover his with her hands. "I am not alone in my thoughts. Her roommate, Anne, was also relocated, and she asked me to take in her dog while she was away. People move into a single ward when they think the end is near. Anne understands this, as does Lenore." Jean turned away, stunned by the grief of the man on the other side of the table. Noticing that the waiter was noticeably fussing, Jean said, "Oh, we have to go." It was already closer to 11. The hotel staff was waiting for the restaurant to close. They went to Jean's room together. Usually he left her at the door and went to his room. But this evening, she invited him to come in. For 5 years now, Jean Stevenson has barely had sex. In the best of times, it was Frank who sought sex from her. Like most women, even after marriage, she found it difficult to come to terms with her own sexuality. But as sexual intimacy gradually weakened and then disappeared completely as the disease progressed, John experienced a deep sense of loss. She yearned for closeness emerging during sexual intercourse. Parker remained celibate for almost 2 years. Sometimes he indulged in self-satisfaction, but mostly he cried, unnoticed, in the shower. Lenore was usually timid in bed, but she always lost her shyness in the thrill of their mutual pleasure. Lenore was an artist, and Parker was a practical, down-to-earth person. However, in bed with Lenore, he learned to be an artist, playing with all the colors of her sexual desires. He developed a palette with which he could paint a portrait of their marital love. In Jean's hotel room, 2 involuntary celibates awkwardly reach out to each other. 2 desperate people in need of physical connection. "Would you like a drink?" Jean asked. I wouldn't refuse. It was a hard day. The drink was followed by a kiss, and it had a much more arousing effect. "We shouldn't do this," Jean said as their lips parted. "You're right," Parker replied, kissing her again. The very thought of sleeping with a man who was not her husband was both unthinkable and at the same time extremely exciting for Jean. Like most women, the most exciting thing about sex in a long-term marriage was the thought of sex with someone other than her husband. It's not that wives are inherently unfaithful, but no woman's romantic dreams involve fidelity. Jean gave herself up to a moment of escape from the painful reality of her life. She grabbed onto the man, who was also drowning, and together they reached the lifeboat of oblivion in the sea of despair. In the morning, Jean woke up and found that Parker was already awake and sitting up. He sat completely still and looked out the window. The window overlooked a dull city street and a sterile office building. "Do you feel guilty?" Jean asked. "Of course," he replied. "And you?" "Same thing," she said, sitting up and moving so that her naked body was next to his. "But I don't regret it," Parker said and turned to kiss her. "Me too," she said when their lips met. So it all started with what was supposed to be a one-off. Jean went to the pharmacy to pick up the morning after pill. Just a precaution, but something she had thought about a week before her blunder. She soon had more reliable contraception, another precaution, but one that proved necessary. As the harsh New York winter turned into a humid spring, they abandoned all pretense and abandoned 2 numbers in favor of 1. Parker never stopped feeling guilty, but he never thought about ending the affair. He divided his existence into 2 spheres. It kept him sane, as he watched cancer take away everything that was meaningful in his life. He assumed it was the same with Jean, but they never talked about it. Now it had become a taboo topic in the air bubble they occupied when they were together. Every morning he left Jean to take his place at Lenore's bedside. Every evening he returned a man, devastated by mental pain, to a woman who suffered no less. They hugged each other, blinking away tears, and pretended that this world was real. In June, everything changed. Summer was only a week away, but it was hot and humid. New York was as uncomfortable as New York can be. He traveled to the hospital from the hotel in the morning heat. Already upon arrival, he realized that something had happened. The nurses were silent, but their faces said that the end was near. Lenore spent that day more lucid than she had been a few weeks ago. They talked about little things, remembering the years of their life together, what Dan was like at 2 years old, and how different Derek was as a baby. She slept a little and woke up in the afternoon. "Sorry, Ed," she said suddenly. He sat by her bed, half asleep, watching the depressing news on the cable TV in the room. It took him a moment to answer, "Forgive." "For what, my love?" "For that. For all this. For putting you through this." He took her hand. "Hey, it is not your fault. Anything can happen. We will get through this together. You will see." He took her hand and smiled, which he hoped was reassuring. "No, I cannot do it anymore. Everything is coming to an end." "I'm sorry," she said, and tears ran down her face. He cried too. They sat like this. She remembered their life together for a long time. She made him promise that he would live on. "Find yourself another," she said. "Don't force her to take the first step like I had to do." He remained by her bedside for the rest of the day. At 5 o'clock, she closed her eyes. She fell into a coma. Just after midnight, an alarm sounded on the monitors, but no scream. It was a quiet, plaintive plea. The nurse came in. The day before, a do not resuscitate order was signed. Lenore, wife, mother, lover, slipped away. When Parker returned to the hotel early that morning, he expected to find Jean, but her things were missing. Notes, too. She did not leave a farewell message. He later learned that her husband had been discharged. It was complete remission, one of the success stories of the new treatment. He visited Anna in hospital to say goodbye, finding her in poor condition. "I'm sorry about Lenore," she began. "I'm not supposed to know, but you always hear whispers." "She just gave up," Parker said. "No," Anne said, grabbing his hand with all the strength she still had left. She accepted the inevitable. "That's exactly what she did. Now it's my turn." "Don't say that." "Why, because it's not true?" "No. I have only one regret. Poor Teddy was left all alone in a dark apartment. Liz, my neighbor, walks and feeds him, but she can't take him in because of her cat. He is good with cats, but the cat is bad with him. Poor Teddy is waiting for my return, but I think he knows that this is a lost hope. I think he realized that I was sick before the doctors did. I've been told that dogs can smell cancer. Spaniels are the best. They can detect very faint odors. My poor boy. He needs someone, and I think you need him. Please take it." Parker took Teddy. They traveled a long way to the north of the state. The dog and the man were both grieving. They arrived at an empty house. Teddy wandered around the floors, for all except the fourth. At the very top of the house was Lenore's old studio. This floor was off limits. Parker didn't go there. It couldn't face his grief. Like Teddy, he lived with hope that was impossible. Thanksgiving dinner at the younger Parker's house was a strange experience. About 20 people were present, several family members, as well as social and professional acquaintances of the newly married couple. Dinner was ordered, and no one could object to the quality or quantity of the food. However, the elder Parker ate very little and shared most of the meal with Teddy, who was in the back room during the feast. After dinner, Parker, avoiding communication, went outside with Teddy. When they had walked quite a bit, Jean caught up with them. They sat down on a lonely bench, set slightly back from the road. near what appeared to be a bus stop, a deserted place in a block of single-family houses with two-car garages. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course," he replied, sitting down. Teddy settled down at his feet. "I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye," she began. "That's not necessary," he said. "We didn't have a real relationship. We just shared a bed for convenience." She sobbed slightly at his words and said, "I deserve it, I guess, but we both know we had something much more." She paused. Both were silent, and then she said, "I love you. I understand that this should not have happened. Of course I didn't want this. But it happened, and then Frank felt better. I didn't know how to tell you about this. I couldn't find the words to say goodbye." Parker turned to her. She cried. "Please don't," he said. "I understand. He is your husband, and he needs you. We've gone too far. No one is to blame for this." "I'm sorry," she begged. "There is nothing to forgive for. But you are lonely." In response, he tugged on Teddy's leash, and the dog looked up at them. "You're forgetting about Teddy," he said. Jean leaned forward and stroked Teddy's head. He licked her hand, and she smiled back. "He is a good companion, but still. We both have a connection that is growing. He has a depth of pain that I cannot yet understand, and he is trying to understand me. This is a work in progress. We continue to live." Lenore and Anne's obituaries were published on the same day. That's what they wrote there. Alive in their memory. They listed all their achievements, but both obituaries ended the same way. Alive in memory. Now everything depends on us. We must find our way. And we're working on it, aren't we, boy? Teddy's gaze was sad, even for a spaniel, and Jean wondered how much the dog could understand. Did he really feel the deep grief of the person sitting next to her? "I have to go back," she said. "Understand. We'll be there soon." On the way, Jean wiped away her tears and touched up her makeup. She made the only possible choice, but already regretted it. Early the next morning, before his daughter-in-law got up, Parker was getting ready to leave. Before he could slip out, his son Dan stopped him to hug him and beg. "I got a call from the Art Institute of Chicago again. They still want to put on an exhibition of Mom's work. They have most of her paintings in the public domain and many from private collections. But they want her latest work, and you still have it," Dan said. "I know," Parker said. "They call me all the time." "What's the problem, Dad?" "It's just," he began. "It is hard to explain." "You can't let her go," Dan pushed. "In a sense, probably. There's a part of me that thinks the same way as Ted," Parker said, stroking the dog. "He still hopes that his owner will come for him and take him home. He must understand that this will not happen, but does not lose hope." When they parted, Dan hugged his father tightly and said, "We need you, Dad. Please come back soon." Parker promised to return when he could. Before leaving home, Parker put Teddy in the front passenger seat of the car. "Well, behave, Ted. Sit on the floor and behave." Teddy got the hang of it, and along the way, whenever he could, Parker leaned over and stroked Teddy's head. The dog seemed to be much happier with this placement. Parker realized that they finally understood each other. Arriving home, they had a late lunch with Teddy's favorite dish, chicken and rice. After lunch, we walked for a long time. Finally, for the first time together, we climbed the stairs to the very top of the building. There, Teddy saw Lenore's studio for the first time. It smelled of paint and turpentine, as well as the musty smell of a long unused room. Canvases were lined up along two walls. On one wall, there are unfinished works and accessories. On the second, there are finished works. Parker settled into a chair placed in the center of the room. Teddy sat at his feet with his head in Parker's lap. Nearby, an easel with an unfinished painting, Len Campbell's last work, stood waiting for the woman who would not return. It was a portrait of her husband. Parker's unfinished image only vaguely resembled himself. It was a portrait of a much younger man, happy, deeply in love. Portrait of a quiet guy following a pretty blonde tour guide in an art museum. The image of a young father and a loving husband who agreed for their Saka to take the job he was able to get. It was not a portrait of a survivor, but an unfinished portrait of an unfinished life. Light streamed through the skylight. Parker pulled a crumpled news clipping from his pocket. It occurred to me that I never read Anne's obituary to you. Teddy remained motionless as Parker read the death notice of Anne Cummings, the famous book editor. Having reached the end, he said, "And here's the part about you. Lives in the memory of his beloved and faithful dog, Theodore Bear Cummings, Teddy." Parker paused, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Then he stood up. "It's time to clean out this room, Teddy. Take these paintings to the Art Institute. There are only 2 of us, but we need to move on." Teddy stretched, scratched his ear, and followed Parker. But he knew he was wrong. They won't be alone for long. A woman named Jean should come. He caught the scent of her husband. He was weak, but kept getting stronger. You can't fool a dog's sense of smell. Frank Stevenson's cancer has returned. Soon there will be only 3 survivors, bound by common pain and doomed to life after the tragedy. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one.